The Tanzanian sun hung low on the horizon, painting the acacia trees in shades of gold and amber. Robert Hayes adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and wiped the perspiration from his weathered face. At 58, the retired mathematics teacher had finally found the courage to embark on the solo African adventure he had dreamed about since childhood. His wife Margaret had passed away 2 years prior, and after months of gentle encouragement from his adult children, Robert decided it was time to step beyond the familiar boundaries of his quiet suburban life. The dusty road stretched endlessly before him, flanked by the vast savanna that seemed to breathe with its own ancient rhythm. Robert had rented a modest four-wheel drive vehicle in Arusha, planning to spend several weeks exploring the lesser-known conservation areas before joining the typical tourist circuits. His teaching background had instilled in him a deep appreciation for learning through direct experience, and he wanted to understand Africa not as a tourist destination, but as a living ecosystem. It was on his third day of solitary exploration that Robert first encountered the small elephant calf. The young animal stood motionless beside a cluster of thorny bushes, its trunk hanging limply toward the ground. Even from a distance, Robert could see the calf's distress. Its ears, which should have been flapping constantly in the heat, hung still against its head. The small body showed signs of dehydration, and there was no adult elephant in sight. Robert parked his vehicle at a respectful distance and observed the scene carefully. His years of teaching had taught him patience and the importance of understanding a situation before taking action. The calf appeared to be approximately 2 years old, still heavily dependent on its mother's milk and protection. In the harsh African wilderness, separation from family meant almost certain death for such a young elephant. The afternoon heat was becoming oppressive, with the thermometer in Robert's vehicle reading 42 degrees Celsius. The air shimmered with heat waves rising from the baked earth, and Robert noticed the calf swaying slightly. Clearly weakened by thirst and exhaustion. Its breathing appeared labored, and small flies had begun to cluster around its eyes and trunk tip, a concerning sign that indicated the animal's declining condition. Robert's mind raced through everything he had read about elephant behavior during his months of preparation for this trip. He knew that elephants were highly intelligent and emotionally complex animals, capable of both fierce protective instincts and surprising gentleness. He also understood that a frightened elephant, even a young one, could be dangerous if it felt cornered or threatened. Without overthinking the decision, Robert retrieved his emergency water supply, a 5-liter container he kept for roadside emergencies, and a small bag of fresh fruit he had purchased that morning from a roadside vendor in the last village. The mangoes and bananas had been intended as his own lunch, but the calf's desperate condition made such considerations irrelevant. He had read enough about elephant behavior to know that approaching too quickly could frighten the already traumatized animal, potentially causing it to flee deeper into the wilderness where it would certainly perish. Moving slowly and deliberately, Robert advanced toward the calf, speaking in soft, measured tones. The young elephant's eyes tracked his movement, but it lacked the energy to flee. Robert carefully poured water into a small metal bowl and placed it within reach of the calf's trunk. The desperate animal immediately began drinking its trunk, working frantically to draw up the life-giving liquid. As the calf drank, Robert noticed several cuts on its legs and trunk, evidence of its struggle through the thorny vegetation. He retrieved his basic first aid kit and began cleaning the wounds with gentle movements. The calf seemed to understand that this strange, upright creature meant no harm, and it allowed Robert to tend to its injuries without resistance. Robert decided to name the calf Kibo after the highest peak of Mount Kilimanjaro, which he could see in the distance. As the hours passed, he remained with the young elephant, offering water at regular intervals and sharing pieces of banana and mango. The calf's condition gradually improved, and its trunk began exploring Robert's hands and clothing with growing curiosity. The sun was setting when Robert heard the deep rumbling call that made his heart race with both relief and anxiety. From the tree line emerged a massive female elephant, her tusks gleaming in the fading light. Her eyes immediately fixed on the scene before her, a strange human sitting beside her missing calf. Robert's first instinct was to retreat to his vehicle, but something in the mother elephant's behavior gave him pause. The female, whom Robert would later think of as Amara, approached with cautious but deliberate steps. Her trunk extended toward her calf, checking for injuries and offering comfort. Then, in a moment that would forever change Robert's understanding of animal intelligence and emotion, Amara turned her attention to him. Her trunk explored his scent, touching his hands and the empty water bowl beside him. For several tense minutes, the three beings remained in a delicate tableau: the exhausted human, the grateful mother, and the rescued calf. Robert's heart pounded as he realized the magnitude of this moment. He was face to face with one of Africa's most magnificent creatures, a matriarch who could easily weigh 4 tons and whose protective instincts for her offspring were legendary. Yet there was no aggression in her posture, no threat in her movements. Amara seemed to be processing the evidence before her with the methodical intelligence that elephants are famous for. Her trunk continued its investigation, touching the empty water bowl, examining Robert's clothes for traces of her calf's scent, and even gently exploring his hands with the sensitive tip of her trunk. The experience was overwhelming for Robert, who had never imagined he would have such intimate contact with a wild elephant. The minutes stretched on, punctuated only by the soft rumbling sounds that Amara made as she communicated with Kibo. Robert began to understand that these vocalizations were not random noises, but a complex language of reassurance and instruction. The mother was telling her calf about this strange encounter, perhaps explaining that this particular human had proven himself trustworthy. Robert's legs were beginning to cramp from remaining motionless for so long, but he dared not move abruptly. He had heard stories of elephants who could detect the slightest change in a person's breathing or heart rate, animals whose intelligence allowed them to read human intentions with startling accuracy. He focused on keeping his breathing steady and his movements minimal, allowing Amara to complete her assessment in her own time. Gradually, her massive body relaxed, the tension leaving her shoulders and trunk. She took a step back, creating more space, but not retreating entirely. Her eyes, surprisingly expressive and intelligent, remained fixed on Robert's face. In that moment, a connection was forged that transcended species boundaries, an understanding based on compassion, care, and the universal language of kindness that flows between all creatures capable of recognizing goodness in others. Robert spent that night camped nearby, sleeping fitfully in his vehicle while listening to the soft, rumbling conversations between mother and calf. When dawn broke, both elephants were gone, but Robert felt profoundly changed by the encounter. He had come to Africa seeking adventure and distraction from his grief, but instead had discovered something far more meaningful: the possibility of connection in the most unexpected circumstances. What began as a single act of compassion evolved into something Robert had never anticipated. Unable to shake the memory of his encounter with Kibo and Amara, he made the decision to extend his stay in Tanzania. He contacted the local conservation authorities and arranged to volunteer at the nearby wildlife research station, using his teacher's pension and savings to support his extended African adventure. Dr. Elizabeth Kimani, the station's director, was initially skeptical of this middle-aged American volunteer who had appeared at her facility with tales of befriending wild elephants. Her 20 years of experience with international volunteers had taught her to be cautious about well-meaning outsiders who often arrived with unrealistic expectations and limited understanding of African wildlife realities. However, Robert's genuine interest in learning his patient observation skills, honed through decades of teaching, and his remarkably gentle demeanor with the animals soon won her respect. She assigned him to assist with the daily monitoring of elephant families in the area work that would keep him in the field for hours each day, documenting behavior patterns, population dynamics, and individual animal identification. Robert threw himself into this work with the enthusiasm of a student half his age, spending his evenings studying elephant social structure, communication patterns, and conservation challenges. The research station's library became Robert's second home as he devoured every available text on elephant behavior. He learned about the complex matriarchal society that governed elephant families, the sophisticated communication network that allowed herds to coordinate across vast distances, and the profound emotional lives of these remarkable animals. Each new piece of knowledge deepened his appreciation for his encounter with Amara and Kibo, helping him understand the significance of their acceptance and trust. The work was physically demanding for a man approaching 60, involving long hours under the blazing African sun, navigating rough terrain and carrying heavy equipment. But Robert found himself rejuvenated by the challenge and purpose. For the first time since Margaret's death, he woke each morning with genuine excitement about the day ahead, eager to return to the field and continue his observations. It was during his second week of volunteer work that Robert encountered Amara and Kibo again. He was conducting a routine survey near a seasonal water hole, documenting the various species that came to drink during the cooler morning hours. The notebook in his hands was filled with careful observations about antelope behavior, bird species, and water levels when the familiar rumbling call made him look up from his meticulous notes. Amara emerged from a grove of fever trees, Kibo close beside her. The moment the mother elephant saw Robert, she stopped and raised her trunk, testing the air for his scent. Recognition was immediate and unmistakable. Amara approached Robert's position with confident steps, her calf following with obvious excitement. Kibo, now healthier and more energetic than during their first meeting, rushed forward to investigate Robert's equipment and clothing with enthusiastic trunk explorations. The reunion was joyful and surprisingly emotional for Robert, who found himself fighting back tears as he realized that these magnificent creatures had remembered him. From that day forward, Robert's work routine was frequently interrupted by visits from Amara and Kibo. The mother elephant seemed to actively seek out Robert's presence, often detouring from her normal foraging patterns to find him. What struck Robert most profoundly was Amara's behavior toward her calf during these encounters. Rather than keeping Kibo close and protected, she would gently push him toward Robert, encouraging interaction and play. Dr. Kimani was fascinated by this unusual relationship and began documenting the interactions for her research with the methodical precision that had made her one of East Africa's most respected elephant researchers. Her initial skepticism transformed into scientific excitement as she observed behaviors that challenged everything she thought she knew about wild elephant interactions with humans. She had spent her career studying elephant social dynamics, publishing papers in prestigious journals about matriarchal leadership, interspecies communication, and elephant emotional intelligence. But she had never observed an adult elephant actively facilitating contact between her offspring and a human. Amara's behavior suggested a level of trust and understanding that challenged conventional wisdom about wild animal behavior, and forced Dr. Kimani to reconsider some of her fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between species. The research implications were staggering. Here was documented evidence of an elephant making deliberate choices about cross-species interaction, demonstrating complex reasoning about human character, and teaching her offspring specific social behaviors related to interspecies friendship. Dr. Kimani began preparing detailed behavioral reports, knowing that the scientific community would need substantial documentation to accept such extraordinary claims. As weeks turned into months, the visits became more frequent and more intimate, following patterns that Dr. Kimani meticulously recorded in her field notebooks. Robert would arrive at his observation post to find Amara and Kibo already waiting for him, their massive forms silhouetted against the morning sky. The mother elephant had developed a routine of gentle encouragement that seemed almost choreographed in its consistency, using her trunk to guide Kibo into Robert's vicinity while she positioned herself as a protective but permissive supervisor. The interactions followed recognizable patterns that suggested learned behavior rather than random encounters. Amara would announce their arrival with specific vocalizations, low-frequency rumbles that carried for miles across the savanna. She would then conduct what appeared to be a security assessment of the area, using her trunk to test air currents and her keen hearing to detect any potential threats. Only after satisfying herself that the environment was safe would she encourage Kibo to approach their human friend. One particularly memorable afternoon, Robert was reading field notes aloud to himself when he noticed both elephants had moved closer to listen. Amara's enormous ears were oriented in his direction, and her eyes seemed focused on his face. Inspired by a whimsical impulse, Robert began reading more theatrically, using different voices for different sections of his report. Kibo responded with obvious delight, swaying to the rhythm of Robert's voice, and occasionally reaching out to touch the notebook with his trunk. This became another ritual in their developing relationship. Robert would bring books from the research station's small library and read aloud to his unusual audience. Amara seemed particularly attentive during these sessions, her massive head tilted slightly, as if concentrating on the cadence of human speech. Meanwhile, Kibo would often settle beside Robert, sometimes even resting his head against the man's shoulder. The reciprocal nature of their friendship became evident when Amara began actively teaching Kibo how to interact appropriately with their human friend. Robert watched in amazement as the mother elephant demonstrated gentle trunk contact, showed her calf how to accept food offerings without being aggressive, and even corrected Kibo when his youthful exuberance became too overwhelming. One extraordinary day, Robert observed Amara carefully selecting a large, perfect leaf from a nearby tree. Instead of eating it herself or offering it to Kibo, she walked directly to Robert and extended the leaf toward him with unmistakable intention. When Robert accepted the gift, Amara turned to Kibo and repeated the leaf selection process, clearly instructing her calf to make a similar offering. The young elephant followed his mother's example with endearing clumsiness, finally managing to present Robert with a slightly chewed but ceremonially significant leaf. These interactions continued for 3 years, during which time Robert made the life-changing decision to relocate permanently to Tanzania. He purchased a small house near the research station and took a position as the facility's education coordinator, developing programs to teach local communities about wildlife conservation. His new life was simple but profoundly fulfilling, centered around his work and his extraordinary friendship with Amara and Kibo. The years brought changes to all 3 friends. Kibo grew from a playful calf into a strong juvenile elephant, his tusks beginning to show and his independence gradually increasing. Amara remained constant in her affection for Robert, but her interactions took on a more mature quality, as if she recognized that their human friend was aging and becoming more fragile. Robert, now in his early 60s, found his energy flagging more quickly than before, and his movements had become slower and more deliberate. Amara seemed to sense these changes, adjusting her behavior to accommodate her friend's limitations. She would position herself closer to Robert during their visits, providing support when he needed to rest, and her trunk touches became gentler and more protective. The bond between them had evolved beyond simple friendship into something resembling a multi-species family relationship. Robert had no human family nearby, having lost touch with his children who lived thousands of miles away and led busy lives. Amara and Kibo had become his emotional anchor, the center of his daily existence and the source of his deepest joy. Robert's final months were peaceful ones spent in the environment he had come to love, with the companions who had given his life new meaning. His health had been declining gradually, a fact he had kept largely to himself, not wanting to worry Dr. Kimani or the other staff members who had become his surrogate family. He continued his daily routines as long as possible, determined to maintain his relationships with Amara and Kibo until the very end. Yamna. On a quiet Tuesday evening in his 61st year, Robert Hayes passed away peacefully in his sleep. Dr. Kimani found him the following morning when he failed to appear for their scheduled planning meeting. He looked serene, she would later tell others, as if he had simply decided it was time to rest after a life well lived. The funeral arrangements were simple, reflecting Robert's modest lifestyle and his distance from family. Dr. Kimani coordinated with Robert's children via telephone and email, but the logistics of international travel meant that the local service would be attended primarily by his Tanzanian friends and colleagues. The burial took place at the small cemetery in the nearby town, a humble plot marked by a simple stone bearing his name and the dates of his birth and death. What happened 3 days after the funeral would become legendary among the local staff and community members who witnessed it. James Mwangi, the cemetery caretaker, was performing his morning maintenance rounds when he noticed unusual footprints near Robert's grave. The massive circular impressions in the soft earth were unmistakably elephant tracks, but their presence in the fenced cemetery seemed impossible. Further investigation revealed that someone, or something, had carefully bent back a section of the cemetery fence without breaking it, creating an opening large enough for elephants to pass through. Near Robert's grave, James found a fresh branch heavy with green leaves placed deliberately on the mounded earth above the coffin. That afternoon, James's mystery was solved when he observed Amara leading Kibo through the improvised entrance to the cemetery. The massive mother elephant moved with obvious purpose, navigating directly to Robert's grave without hesitation. Her behavior suggested familiarity with the location, as if she had been there before during the night hours when the cemetery was empty. What James witnessed next would remain etched in his memory forever. Amara positioned herself several yards away from the grave, assuming a posture of patient observation. Meanwhile, Kibo, now a substantial young elephant in his own right, approached Robert's final resting place with careful, deliberate steps. Using his trunk with surprising delicacy, Kibo selected leaves from the branch that had been left during their previous visit and arranged them carefully on top of the grave. His movements were precise and ceremonial, suggesting behavior that had been taught rather than instinctive. After completing this ritual, Kibo stepped back and turned to look at his mother, his posture clearly seeking approval or confirmation. Amara's response was subtle but unmistakable. She extended her trunk slightly and made soft rumbling sounds that James recognized as communication. The exchange had the quality of a lesson being completed, a student checking with a teacher to ensure the task had been performed correctly. This remarkable scene repeated itself monthly for the remainder of that year and continued into the next. Always, Amara would lead Kibo to the cemetery during quiet hours, position herself as observer and supervisor, and watch as her son performed the learned ritual of placing fresh vegetation on Robert's grave. Each visit followed the same pattern: careful preparation, ceremonial placement of offerings, and the young elephant's deferential check with his mother for approval. James began documenting these visits initially out of simple curiosity, but eventually with growing amazement at their consistency and apparent meaning. He shared his observations with Dr. Kimani, who recognized the profound significance of what was occurring. Amara was teaching Kibo about gratitude, about remembering those who had shown kindness, and about maintaining connections that transcended death. The cemetery visits became a subject of fascination for researchers and conservationists throughout East Africa. Here was documented evidence of elephants demonstrating complex emotional responses, teaching abstract concepts to their offspring, and maintaining what could only be described as ritual behavior related to death and remembrance. But for those who had known Robert Amara and Kibo during their years of friendship, the meaning was simpler and more profound. They were witnessing the final chapter of an extraordinary relationship, a demonstration that love and gratitude create bonds that survive even death. Amara was ensuring that her son would never forget the human who had shown them kindness during a moment of desperate need. The visits continued for 3 years after Robert's death, with Kibo growing into full adulthood under his mother's patient instruction. Each month brought the same careful ritual: the journey to the cemetery, the placement of offerings, and the young elephant's respectful check for maternal approval. Gradually, Kibo's movements became more confident and independent, requiring less direct guidance from Amara. On what would prove to be their final visit, James observed a subtle but significant change in the dynamic between mother and son. For the first time, Kibo performed the entire ritual without looking back at Amara for confirmation. His movements were assured and reverent, demonstrating that the lesson had been fully internalized. The young elephant had learned not just the physical actions of remembrance, but the emotional significance behind them. After that visit, Amara and Kibo were seen less frequently in the area around the research station. Other observers reported sightings of them ranging farther afield, following the ancient migration patterns that would take them to new territories and new adventures. But James continued to find fresh offerings on Robert's grave each month, evidence that the lesson had taken root and would continue even as the teacher stepped back to allow her student full independence. Dr. Kimani often reflected on the profound implications of what she had witnessed during those remarkable 3 years. In her research papers and conference presentations, she would describe the relationship between Robert Amara and Kibo as one of the most compelling examples of interspecies emotional intelligence ever documented. But beyond the scientific significance lay something even more important: a demonstration that kindness creates connections that transcend every boundary: species, time, and even death itself. The story of the retired teacher and the elephant family he had helped spread throughout the conservation community and beyond, inspiring others to look for ways to bridge the gap between human and animal worlds. It became a reminder that small acts of compassion can create profound and lasting change, that understanding and respect can flow both ways between species, and that some lessons are so important they must be passed from one generation to the next. In the end, Robert Hayes had come to Africa seeking adventure, and found instead a family that would remember him long after his human friends had forgotten the details of his quiet life. He had given Kibo water in a moment of need, and received in return a form of immortality. The knowledge that his kindness would be remembered and honored through ritual and story, passed down through generations of elephants who had learned that some humans are worthy of gratitude and respect. The simple act of sharing water with a thirsty calf had rippled forward through time, creating connections that enriched all their lives and left behind a legacy of understanding that would outlast them all. In the vast savanna where life and death dance in eternal rhythm, Robert's story became part of the larger narrative of compassion that binds all living things together in an intricate web of mutual dependence and care. And in a small cemetery in Tanzania, fresh leaves continue to appear each month on a simple grave, placed there by remembering hands that learned the value of gratitude from a mother who understood that some lessons are too important to let die with those who first taught them.